So I realize there's kind of 2 points to this. So I'm gonna start just as an example here, okay? So of course, Devin, and today I'm in Minnesota, and not far from Eau Claire. I almost passed through, I went the south route from northern Michigan today, so I almost passed through Duluth. And I've had a lot of really amazing states this week, driving in my car, listening to audiobooks, reflecting and integrating. And for me, a car is like a classroom. I drove about 200,000 miles listening to audiobooks a number of years ago. So that's really one of my home abodes. And in addition, I have a practice that gets me in a psychological flow writing every morning. And so that's been really fun while traveling about. And yesterday, I was also quite sick. And I was quite sick because of all of this traveling and not managing my energies. And so that's an example of kind of one of the downward sort of moments. And then finally, something that I've been learning about myself is just how much I love towns that are immersed in wilderness. And, we had that in Hawaii with Kapa'au, for those of you who were there. This small town embedded within natural environments and wilderness. Similarly, I had that in Yukon, in Alaska. And these are remote places. And where I was for the last couple of days in a place called Marquette, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula, folks there are talking about the Upper Peninsula versus the rest of Michigan in the same way that people in Hawaii are talking about, the island and Howleys, in the same way that in Yukon, Alaska, there's the differentiation there. And so an area that I love this, and that's part of what I'm learning about myself. So that's me in a minute or so. Emmanuel, perhaps you can go next, and then we'll go to Janet and Chris and Tim and Rob and Ryan and Cheryl. Claire will finish with you.
All right. Thanks for opening, Devin. I'm Emmanuel, and I was really inspired this week by kind of getting into my body and specifically getting out and doing some rock climbing in the rock climbing hall and kind of getting back into that and just feeling really alive when doing that. And it just felt, just feeling really alive. Something that was challenging for me is that generally I felt really kind of down this week and a little challenged. And I went out on Friday and ran into my ex-girlfriend, and that, kind of hurt a little bit. And it's just challenging to kind of move through that. But it was also kind of really sweet to kind of touch into that space. And then what I learned about myself was that physical activity really helps me kind of move through stress and move through emotions and kind of reset my mind to a space where I can do new things again or move into something new. So whenever I feel kind of stuck or down, and I can get myself to go rock climbing or go on a walk outside or just do some yoga, it often helps me kind of move through those emotions. And that was really powerful this week for me. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. And we'll move to Janet.
Hi. Let's see. My week. I had a pretty remarkable week last week after we met. I spent 3 days in my office with clients, 12 different clients, all 12 clients with some pretty remarkable results after their sessions. That always inspires me. And then Saturday, I don't know if it was the weather. I don't know exactly what happened, but all of a sudden we didn't have sunshine and it was cold and rainy. And I found myself really in the doldrums and feeling really lonely. Like I called a couple of people to say, hey, let's go do something. And people weren't home, weren't answering. And finding myself just really low and down on Saturday. And Sunday morning, all of a sudden my phone started ringing off the hook and people wanted to go do things and people wanted to connect. and I wasn't able to because I had plans to garden all day, and I really wanted to do that. So it was just kind of an interesting thing to watch myself go through this feeling of not belonging someplace or belonging with people, and then it was almost like that feeling came up and actually drew them to me, which was kind of an interesting thing to observe. So then I gardened all day Saturday, all day Sunday, all day Monday, like really marathon gardened, and I wore myself out. So I've just been kind of lazy all day today, and I'm happy and content today.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like there's self-learning within that week there. So excellent.
Yeah. Thank you.
We'll move to Chris and then Tim.
I'm Chris. Last week, I feel like was extra busy. It was just a lot scheduled. A lot happened. I've been for a while focusing most of my attention on a creative project. It is a self-help journal that's also a game, like a role-playing game, and I'm very close to it being finished, which is a little bit stressful and frightening, but also exciting, of course. It's just a new phase in the project. I just think it's really interesting when you're getting close to, when I talk to people, I think sometimes that struggle with this, like getting close to the end of a creative project, you kind of have to have another train to jump to in a way. At least that's my belief, because achievement is like the middle of the process, right? It keeps going, and fulfillment is not the same as achievement. So being aware of that, I'm sort of thinking ahead what next pieces I can do. So there was some inspiration there. I studied essentially some bits of tarot this weekend. I stayed in and relaxed because last week was stressful. So, or not necessarily stressful, but busy. So
Chris, any self-learning that to draw out here?
Self-learning. I mean, I could go into a whole other story, I guess, about that, because there was a lot that happened. But the main point would be that I'm really grateful that I've learned what I've learned to arrive at a place in life where I can give myself rest when I need it. And that's that. You were just talking about that, Janet, and I think that is so important to just be like, yeah, I'm tapping out. I'm not going out. I'm not saying yes to things. I stayed in bed and I watched, Stargate SG-1, and I sci-fi juiced it. So I feel like the self-learning was really just like self-care and just being grateful that I can do that.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Tim and then Rob.
Let's see. First thing, I was just wondering, my computer thinks that I'm streaming video. I was wondering if anybody can see me. Okay, right on.
I can't, but I can hear you.
That's so interesting. I wonder why that is. Anyway, next thing is just that I'm sorry that I missed the first week. I been working at a retreat center in the mountains where the internet's been off, so there's been no way to do anything streaming or audio or anything. So
we're glad you're here, Tim.
Thank you. Minute. The last week, I would say there were some moments of vulnerability, of connection, and yeah, settings for that were a workshop that I was participating in the last couple of days, some bodywork sessions where I'm a therapist, meditation, and sex. Those are probably sort of peak state moments that I don't generally live in, of connection. And in the workshop, just a sort of a resonance. You'd asked about inspiration in the last week. Seeing people grow or release or move through fear or open up is a real there's a lot of that in this last week, and that's very inspiring for me. And that's everything from attendees of this workshop to bodywork clients to my partner to friends. Does that check all the boxes?
That's significant and succinct. Thanks, Tim.
All right.
Rob.
Hello, my name's Rob. I've been in Yosemite National Park for much of this week. It was my first time there. Really awe-inspiring to see Yosemite Valley and the giant sequoias. Something that was especially inspiring, one evening I went to it was kind of like a one-man monologue, a guy acting as John Muir, who, was an integral figure in Yosemite and the creation of Yosemite. And just an incredible story, and his perspective on the park, his kind of divine and spiritual connection to the place and to nature was really moving. A lot of the monologue was, quotes directly from John Muir. Part that I found challenging, I recently saw my family, I don't know, maybe 2-3 weeks ago, and stuff got brought up, from childhood with my stepdad, and just still, still processing that. I had a call with my mum, and that helped. But there certainly was anger and sadness expressed, and I felt a lot better after the call. So I guess I learned that sometimes it helps just to express, even if nothing other than that changes.
Yeah, just to express. Yeah, wonderful. Ryan, and then Cheryl.
Hi everyone, I'm Ryan, and it's great to see our ranks swelling and great to see some new faces here today. I've had a couple of challenging days just because I haven't slept very well, so I'm kind of in a dreamy, kind of a weird state where I don't even remember what happened the last few days. But I've been really busy at the same time. I've kind of been running around like a chicken with his head cut off. But right before the call, I was having a lot of fun tinkering with a slideshow that I know that you and Devin and Emmanuel have watched of. My integral slideshow is about 10 minutes, and it takes you through each stage of consciousness with music and images. And I was tinkering with the end, and an incredibly nerdy, geeky kind of moment of joy, I synced the ending to the Avengers Endgame trailer. And so I watched it like 15 times. I was just laughing. So it was a lot of fun, and I'll send it out in email to everyone after the call.
Nice.
Excellent, Ryan. And then that'll be really good because next week we are going to go into the vertical stages. So really good timing on that, Ryan. Cheryl.
Yeah, I had a good week. I think, ups and downs. I was able to do some writing in the morning, which was really, felt really good. I took some time to myself to write and did some poems. I got good feedback on them. And then there was maybe like one sunny day, maybe two. And I got out to plant some flowers in pots. So it was nice to just I really like color. So just to see the colors of the planted flowers was really nice. And, just the colors, kind of like what you were saying, Devin, about the wilderness or nature, having color. Physical activity, too, helps me a lot as well. So something that's happened in my life, I don't think I spoke about it last week, but I had a heart attack March 18th. And so I need to do physical activity, but it also, besides needing to, the first thing I really found was that it just helps clear my mind and helps, bring me to the homeostasis that I need. in my life recently has been very, very up and down. So trying to learn from my body and take that time. I really found the reading interesting or the video interesting and helpful on my own journey that I'm taking, trying to remind myself to slow down and take it easy. It's not one of my go-to places, but I'm learning that I can be comfortable with it, and so that shadowy part is like my ego going, oh no, we want to do this, we want to do that, and me having that little conversation with my ego to say, look, what we're going to do now, it's this other thing. So it's been a very interesting process.
And grateful that you're here today, Cheryl. And it seems to be a theme that, at least Janet and Chris have also brought up of this restfulness. So wonderful. And finally, Claire, with our kind of opening comments here. I'm on mute.
I booked tickets for a concert a long time ago and I didn't want to miss it, but it was really good. And that was a peak for me, I suppose. It was just something I did by myself for fun. And it's sort of new for me to spend time doing things that aren't work related, because I find a point of, and I find that you all are experiencing this as well. I've been taking notes on what you've been saying, and you guys find stress often in maybe dealing with like interpersonal stuff, or like how other people affect you. I've noticed in various ways between all of you, but you found a lot of pleasure in like doing work, and you were finding a lot of inspiration from things that you were working on that weren't necessarily purely for pleasure. So I decided that I would do this for myself. And so that was a peak. Sort of I guess like a fluctuation I had was I also had a race this weekend and it didn't go very well and it annoyed me quite a bit. But it was sort of one of those moments where I was realizing I wasn't in a place to run well, and sort of coming to terms with that over the course of the weekend was, but satisfying, and has me looking forward to more things, more racing in the future and stuff. So that was last week, and variance.
Excellent. So glad you're here, Claire, and thank you for the comments. With that, I'm going to now move into discussing a bit about transpersonal psychology. And so very, very briefly, I thought it was really important to get a bit of the historical perspective of how Integral came into being. So when we look at psychology as a discipline or a field, there's essentially 4 different waves. And so it began as with behaviorism, which then moved into analysis. And so this first wave and the second wave focused essentially on body and mind, so the inner dimensions of the physical self. And these dominant waves pervaded until around the 50s. And then, earlier on we were talking about Esalen. And Esalen is the world's first personal growth center in it's south of San Francisco, in kind of the Monterey, Santa Cruz area where Rob is. And it was developed by a guy named Mike Murphy and others. And Abe Maslow was instrumental, as was Carl Rogers, in the formation of humanistic psychology. And this is the third wave. And it was a big, big difference, because the first and second wave in behaviorism and analysis, it was all about deficiencies. So we would go in and ask, what are your problems and how can we fix them? What's wrong with you? What are your weaknesses? And it's a very, very different orientation when we start flipping that around and we start with a starting point of sufficiencies. And we ask, well, what are the possibilities? What are the strengths? What are the potentialities that are present within these deficiencies? So this is, the burgeoning of humanistic psychology, known as the third wave. That's really cool, Rob, that you're in that terrain right now. And so the video then picks us up into the movement from humanistic psychology into transpersonal psychology. So now we're going beyond the personal. And we're also including elements that weren't included in humanistic psychology, such as different states of consciousness. Now, I practiced shamanism for a couple of years. And so shamanism is an example of something that would be included in transpersonal psychology. So would different states, such as dreams, and can be particularly impactful. And there are many others, including LSD and others. So we have the four waves here. We have behaviorism, analysis, and then we have humanistic, and then we have transpersonal. Now, Ken Wilber emerges in the 70s, and he starts publishing in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. He's writing. He's going to college, and he's from Nebraska. He's going to college, and he's essentially dropping out because he's becoming so fascinated with all these connections that are found in terrains outside of what he's learning in class. And so he starts publishing in transpersonal psychology. And eventually there's kind of a split in transpersonal psychology. And this split is, in the integral terms, is towards integral philosophy on one hand, and the other split is towards positive psychology. Okay, so the focus of this course is mostly on integral psychology and philosophy, but not exclusively, because there's a lot of positive psychology elements that are brought forth. So I'm going to briefly talk about positive psychology. Now, when we look into what positive psychology is, it is defined as the scientific study of individual and community flourishing. So we're talking about affluence. We're talking about the flowing or the outflowing of this abundance. Now, positive psychology was founded by two people. You may not know their names, but you're probably going to know what they're kind of known for. One is a fellow named Martin Seligman. And so he talked about learned helplessness. He talked about optimistic explanatory styles and pessimistic explanatory styles. Big difference there. So basic explanatory style is I stub my toe and then I explain what happened to me. So if I stub my toe with a pessimistic explanatory style, I'm going to keep 3 P's with me. It's going to be permanent, pervasive, and personal. So permanent means, oh, I'm going to have a busted toe forever. It's pervasive. It's not just a busted toe. I wrecked the day. And the personal element is, it's the shaming element of how would I do this? I'm so stupid. Now that's perhaps an exaggeration, but an example. An optimistic explanatory style looks at the reverse. So it's temporary, it's specific, and it's universal. So universal, everybody does this. Specific, so what? I've got a little toe that has a boo-boo on it. And it's temporary. This too shall heal. Okay, so that's explanatory styles. So that's kind of Martin Seligman's one of his key contributions. He then became very big in studying happiness. So happiness studies. And that's based on states. It's quite different than flourishing, kind of the eudaimonia of all this. States are very temporary. The other fellow is a guy named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And you probably heard of being in the zone or psychological flow. And essentially these are states where time and space just disappear. And our deepest, highest, most generative kind of spiritual element takes over. And it happens when 2 phenomena come together. When our current skill comes forth and meets a challenge, but the challenge is just a little beyond where our current skill is. And it has to be focused towards something. So it's not like going in and just, being in a reflective space. There's a telos, there's a directionality, there's an endpoint in which our skill and our challenge, our leading edge, is just a little beyond that. And when you look at the research, it's about 4 or 5% beyond that. So if my skill is right here at 100%, I want a challenge. It's 104, 105, 106%, just a little beyond the leading edge. That produces growth. So that's positive psychology. And how it then, of course, meets integral psychology is bringing together all these disparate elements that weren't really considered before. So, quick little overview of transpersonal psychology, how it relates to positive psychology as well as integral psychology and philosophy. I'm a little light on the definitions of integral because that's what the gestalt of this entire time together is about in this first course here. So with that, I'm going to be quiet and open it up for any sort of comments or reflections or considerations that might benefit the cohort. So it's an open.
Hi. As it pertains to the reading or the show, or not the show, the movie we watched, or just in general, as far as the reflections you want us to offer, Devin.
Yeah, within the scope of reflective practice, optimally kind of motivated by the video, but within the context of today's conversation, Claire.
Yeah. So I have a couple of reflections that I recorded here on the video. One of which where we're sort of looking at this. These two or explanatory styles, the pessimist and the optimistic. I related that to the windshield analogy from the last 10 minutes or so. I don't remember the person's name or whatever, but where they talk about these like universal inputs, and then sort of like how we, desecrate or maybe enhance the windshield affects our inputs, and sort of like looking at those inputs and the sort of marks that we have, and being able to see where they're universal and where seeing that we're like taking in the same message, this like universal idea of a message, but like in spite of our different cultural upbringings. I thought that was another thing that we sort of touched on in the first reading, that and also they brought up in the first few minutes of the video, like if I'm born here, this is the truth. If I'm born someplace else, what's the truth there? I found that really like as a good point of connection, because I think that there are a lot of there's like almost a truth more in regressing and like shedding those presuppositions of like what the world is and what your truth is. So going back to what I sort of said in the intro, a lot of people find satisfaction in like working at something, because that's kind of like, finding a purpose is like the most important part of being alive. And a lot of us relate purpose to work. So I mean, maybe I've gone on too long, but yeah, I like the windshield analogy, and then like connecting that to positive psychology as a communication style, I suppose. So, or as our explanatory style. Sorry.
Awesome, Claire. So I want to bring in mindfulness now. Now we can call it whatever. There's a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, and he defines mindfulness in a way that's very, very similar to what Claire's talking about, the windshield or these lenses in positive psychology. And this is he defines it as noticing our noticing on purpose, in the present moment, with caring intent and compassionate judgment. So there's judgment in place, but it's bound within compassion and caring intent. And it's on purpose, and it's the present moment. It's not looking forward to achievements in the future, what might become. When we have anxiety, when we're in a place where our challenge is bigger than our skill. And when our skill is bigger than our challenge, we get bored and just kind of check out. And mindfulness, or whatever we want to call it, but noticing what we notice on purpose in the present moment with compassionate judgment and caring intent brings us to a place of a really optimal place. When we're in a state of flow, we become more and more of who we already are. It's like these optimal states, and optimal really means best, or like drawing out the best in ourselves. It's best for everybody in many ways. So I'm just, kind of tying that in with the windshield metaphor, as well as some of these positive psychology. So just kind of another scaffolding or layer to put in here, mindfulness.
And those, I think another thing that I want to touch on was the idea, and I think that this video, from my perspective, focused heavily on as part of integral theory, and the idea that oh man, where was I going with that? So they sort of dive into the fact that there are things that don't work for everyone else. I remember very specifically listening to the part where they were sort of talking about the experiments that they were doing with, I can't remember, it was some sort of substance, and that there were some people who were just getting lost in the pleasure of it and that sort of thing. And I find that interesting because I think that states are so untrustworthy, and maybe it's just maybe my background in more of a scientific background, like, and also coming from running, it's never good to just like to take judgments at the highest point. So hearing them talk about the or like judge based on like your best results and like where you're like succeeding the most, it's good to be mindful and having that all noticing idea that Devin brought up. So often it's easy to not notice the small signs of pushing yourself too hard or doing things too much, because you're putting yourself in you're relying on this state as maybe you're thinking that you've moved to a new level within something, but you're really just getting lost sort of in the pleasure of the ecstasy of like an aha moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for your comments, Claire. Comments from other people here today. Chris?
Okay. I thought there was an interesting part where he was talking about funding for the program, like for the research. And at one point they got shut down, right? And they got the letter. And they went through all these processes to sort of apply for more funding and grants. And ultimately they came to hear this sort of response like, you're not getting more funding because you already proved that it works. Meaning, the LSD and kind of going through those trials and tests. And I just think that that's really interesting that like they would acknowledge that it works, but they're also not going to allow them to do it anymore. And it's kind of, I think, says it's sort of a microcosm of the macrocosm we deal with here in the West, where everything's so regulated and has to be managed and measured, and it restricts a lot. That kind of made me feel like I wanted to do LSD.
Okay. And I wonder if so next week we're going to delve into stages.
Are we going to do LSD?
Into stages of
yeah, you'll all receive a little package from us in the next week.
Do it.
So Chris, I was picking up on other elements and suggesting that next week we're going to delve into stages a little more. And it sounds to me like that's a very sort of orange conventional subtle individual orientation. Just trying to translate a different stage, and it just gets really trippy and it doesn't work.
Right. Fascinating.
Yeah. Other comments, questions? reflections?
Not directly related to the video, but something that came up to me or came up in my mind while I was watching the video is something you often say, Devin, where you throw out a topic for discussion, and I've had the tendency to think that that there is a right answer, but I was just playing with it in my mind that there isn't necessarily a right answer for any question. Like it really just depends on the level that you're coming from, and right is going to look completely different from different levels. And it was just a fun, I started laughing just by myself. It was a fun concept to just play with in my head.
Yeah, as Ken Wilber says, we're all right. Some of us have, more rightful and less rightful, but there isn't necessarily a right answer. I think Wilber says exactly that nobody's smart enough to be right 100% of the time. Something to that extent. And yeah.
I think that one of Wilber's points that I really liked and have had some time wrestling with is this idea that and maybe I'm skipping ahead too far, but that sort of addressing what Rob said, that there's like this sort of hyper subjectivity. If you give credence to it, everything can be right or wrong. And I think that sort of comes from this world we live in, where there's all these quadrants that are out of balance between there's so much dissonance between different things, and people are trying to solve problems through ways that maybe will get a result, but it's not like an ethical result. It's not that people are willing to do things that are that punish themselves, or knowing or unknowing, things such as consuming fossil fuels. We get the benefits of a growing economy, but and that helps people get jobs. But the thing is, an economy is like a really relative thing, and if it's ultimately a bad thing because it's built on like wrong, sort of wrong-minded, imbalanced quadrants, then it's ultimately like hurting everyone. And this idea, like there being that subjectiveness within the imbalance, but I think that through like regression and sort of like finding a balanced quadrant, you're going to find more like objective truths and less subjectivity. I think that like there are things that are universally good for us, and like things that are bad. And I think that when you mix things, that water gets muddied quite a bit.
Claire, this is I'd like to bring this forward to our conversation when we, talk about showing up in quadrants, because I think you're bringing forth some really, really good points. And it's important that we, include as much as we can, and also recognize that what we don't exclude, we're going to have all sorts of biases. And applying it to this sort of conversation, these biases are our shadows. What we don't exclude or what we don't include and we exclude ends up showing up as what irks us and what irritates us, and ultimately what causes these stresses and strains. And transpersonal psychology starts bringing in some of these states, along with a whole bunch of other elements. I'm going to pause for a moment here, and I'm going to ask Janet to see if she has any comments, because I know you've studied with Stan Groff and have a fair bit of expertise in this area. I wonder if you might contribute.
Oh, well, what I'd like to contribute is I was grateful to watch the video. I watched it last night, and I was incredibly grateful to hear other people besides Stan. I love Stan a whole lot, but I was I enjoyed very much hearing other people's input and stance on where transpersonal psychology came from. And something about the video that really struck me, there was the question, who's drawn to transpersonal psychology? And And for myself, I was drawn to transpersonal psychology, of course, through holotropic breathwork, because that's where it was introduced into my world. But as I've sat with that and spent time in that training, what I recognize is the transpersonal is very much a part of my everyday life, and it was through my training in holotropic breathwork, which is a fair amount of transpersonal psychology, even though we don't get that degree, that I finally came to a place where I could accept that about myself. So that's really the biggest thing that I have to input at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could you restate that last sentence? I didn't quite hear it. About the, you got into it for one reason and then you had this insight. Could you restate that insight?
Oh, my insight was that I moved into the world of transpersonal psychology simply because of my training in holotropic breathwork, and what I discovered in all of my training and all of the time spent with everybody else in that training, that transpersonal is very much a part of my everyday life. And so through my training, I've come to accept that, and I'm still working on learning how to work with it. Even through all of my trainings, I'm still learning how to trust it, I guess, is the best way to put that.
So if I understand you, you're saying kind of like you've had this information coming in, these experiential states, or even maybe it's just a stage of yours, but you haven't allowed that to inform some of your behaviors. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, Tim, we've had this conversation.
And bingo again.
Yeah.
Cheryl, Ryan, Emmanuel, Tim, comments?
One thing that I found really interesting in the video was when she, talked about non-rational experiences and how they can be pre-rational, or I think she called it transrational or post-rational, and just kind of making that distinction is something that's been was interesting for me, and also kind of in like context with like kind of the pre-post fallacy stuff that Wilbur talks about, which we might touch into later in a different call. But then the kind of next thing that she said was like, the idea of healing the split mind and the broken heart, which just kind of really resonated with me on a deeper level. And it also just reminded me of a friend of mine who's just going through, just had a psychotic episode and going through the system kind of with that, and kind of wondering how that kind of information could help her in her recovery process and in her integration process. Yeah. Okay.
I wanted to sort of ask you, Emmanuel, about your insights on post rationality, or even with pre, trans, and post rationality, and sort of where those fit in as far as integral theory. I'm interested by the words themselves, but I would like to learn more about them. I don't know those.
I mean, I'm not really familiar with kind of this idea of pre-rational experiences and trans-rational experiences either. Kind of what I get from it is that there's, kind of more primary experiences that exclude our thinking mind, and those would be more pre-rational experiences. Like a baby, for example, would have more of a pre-rational experience because they don't have an analytical mind to kind of support the thinking process. But then if it's an experience that includes kind of the thinking mind but goes beyond that, that would be kind of more of a trans-rational experience. But I don't know, does anybody else have a better or different explanation?
Well, and I think to further this with the what Ken Wilber calls the pre-trans fallacy, is because something is non-conventional or unconventional, we tend to think that it's, it's post-conventional. But in Claire, you've used the word regressive twice, yet oftentimes these will actually be regressive. So we'll actually be pushing out elements of ourselves and excluding them, and ultimately creating shadow areas in there. So these broken mind and broken heart areas. And so there's when we go into these, there's a pre and a post element, and it's really easy to confuse the two.
So the part that was intriguing to me sort of was the term was mostly the term post rationality, and sort of as a concept as it pertains to like social politics, I suppose. I think that like there's not a lot of rationality. You can't like justify a lot of socialist thoughts super rationally. You just have to be, you kind of like believe it or you don't, and you maybe think it's the right thing or not. And a lot of times when I'm like, with groups or like, speaking on this, a common sentiment that's thrown around is that like being realistic is something that you need to give up on. So I was seeing if there was a connection there at all. And I just like that idea of like giving up on being realistic for the sake of something.
There's an integral philosopher named Gene Gebser, and he speaks of the deficient element of the mental realm is ultimately a form of evil. And so when we have this judgment without a compassionate judgment, or a strict efficiency without kind of a greater holistic element, you can do a lot of damage through that. And I think that ties into this conversation anyways. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm wondering if Cheryl has her hand up.
Yeah, I was struck by those comments too. In fact, I went back and I had to verbatim, watch the video with closed caption on and write it all down, because I thought I really liked, I had never heard anybody put that concept into words, because it was something that I was experiencing as well. So I was trying to figure out why I've had some of those pre-rational experiences, 3 in a row. We'll talk about those later. But so I couldn't figure out why I was so hung up on trying to like feel normal or do normal things, or what was that all about? Like, why did I keep trying to return to this place? And I thought she put it really well, because she says basically you need to have some kind of grounding. You need to have that balance and that grounding so that your life's not like totally disrupted. And that made total sense to me, because if you're having a lot of either, pre-rational experiences or, and some of them being what you call trans-rational, you need to, even that you need to have some place to kind of also go where you can feel grounded. And I liked how she kind of wrapped that up by saying simply making friends with the ego, and that's kind of where I landed on that today. I was like, oh, okay, I see there's a place for this little ego person. And I think it fits in with what you're saying about the awareness, because I was questioning. I was like, what is going on? Why does my mind keep wanting to go back to this place of normal when what's happening isn't normal? And then one of the women had spoke early on about making a space, that when you go through these shock sort of experiences, that one of the things that happens is there's this big space that opens up. And I experienced that big space too, and I was like, oh, there's a big space here. What am I going to do with this space? Lots of options, lots of opportunities, lots of questions. Just anyway, that's all I have to say for now.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear, Cheryl. I'm wondering if Ryan has any comments.
No, I'm just enjoying listening to everyone.
All right. So any sort of, we have about 5 minutes left. Any closing comments? This will be kind of like popcorn style. If you have anything that you'd like to communicate with the cohort, now is an opportunity to do so.
I just to offer something in. One of the things I'm really interested in is this idea that, you know, states develop into stages along specific developmental lines. And for me, there's an ongoing curiosity about how, when I see, and I'm curious about so many lines, how to choose where to put my energy and when, like in what order to try to develop things. So creating that map. And then part of that is really ties into the, and I can never say his name, but the flow guy who talked about the relationship between appropriate challenge and competence or skill level or whatever. And knowing how to do that well is part of that. There's some desire in me for, you know, efficiency and achievements and all, but sometimes I get bulked up just trying to make the plan, set the course. And the other thing I'd say is that it's interesting to think about this in terms of my godson, who's a teenager who's massive anxiety, and being with him and thinking and looking and watching and trying to imagine where his needs are and how to challenge him just the tiniest bit to increase his window of tolerance of comfort so that he can function better. Kind of related.
Yeah, it sure is, Tim. And I'm reminded of Maslow, Abraham Maslow, and he said basically we move in one of two directions. We move in the direction of growth, or the direction of security, of comfort, of more of the same. And so when we look at our skill level and creating the container to move into psychological flow, it's moving in the direction of growth. It's, you know, what am I comfortable with? And then going an extra 5%, whatever it is, day after day after day, instead of, you know, this is what I'm comfortable with, this is what I'm confident with, and just sticking there. We're never going to get in that zone. And remember, we become more and more of who we already are. That means our uniqueness also becomes more, and at the same time, we become more transpersonal. We become beyond ourselves as our uniqueness comes forth. So continuously stepping into that, you know, that leading edge of personal growth instead of just, you know, the mediocrity. Mediocrity means, in the original essence of the word, it means starting to climb a rugged mountain and stopping midway. And transpersonal psychology, you know, there was a line in there in the video that said something about this was a reaction to mediocrity, to starting to climb a rugged mountain and just stopping and just, you know, no more growth. I'm comfortable here and let's flatland. Any other final closing comments here?
Just you describing your godson's anxiety just made me think of something I heard recently. It was in How to Change Your Mind by I forget the name of the author, but he did the Omnivore's Dilemma as well.
Michael Pollan.
Yeah, Michael Pollan, that's it. And they were talking about how stepping into someone's ordinary day-to-day state of consciousness and, like, you know, their thoughts and their mindset and how they view the world would be, you know, even more different than taking LSD, for example. And that's just I don't know, it's just an interesting concept to think about, that everyone's, you know, frame of reference is so different.
Yeah, that perspective taking.
Yeah.
This pretty well closes our time together today. Next week we're gonna step into perspective taking a little bit more as we explore the stages of development, which is ultimately about increased perspective taking. But before we get then, I want to really encourage everyone to, you know, kind of hold that opportunity of you know, to move into growth, and when we have the opportunity to, or if we notice we're just, you know, stumbling into comfort and security, to recognize that and say, okay. And, you know, if we want to move into growth, to maybe flip the switch, and it just, you know, really kind of be aware of that. And also, if there's anything to share next time in that regards, we'll do so. But thank you for the call here today. Rob, appreciate you calling in. And Tim, it's great to see you. And Chris too. It's been a while. Same with Claire. Ryan, good seeing you again. Janet and Cheryl and Emmanuel. See you again in a week.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
See you all.
Bye everyone. Have a good week.
Night.